The Crusades was one of the most significant movements in medieval history. Hundreds of thousands over the centuries marched from Western Europe all the way to the Middle East to fight for glory and the Christendom. In this video I want to shortly explain and then rank the Crusades from the worst to the best. I created this ranking based on short and long-term success, both personally for the participants and in general for the Catholic world. So don't be surprised when you see my number 2. Also keep in mind that I'm only including the mainstream Crusades against the Muslims of the East, so don't expect to see the Northern Crusades or the Reconquista. Before we get to the rankings, please subscribe and leave a like. Enjoy! At the bottom of the list lies the disastrous Crusade of Varna, 1444. This crusade was launched by the King Vladislav of Poland, Lithuania, and Hungary against the Ottoman Empire. The mighty armies of Hungary, Poland, and Lithuania were also joined by volunteers from Europe and local allies like the Wallachians. Vladislav ended up getting himself foolishly killed in a brave attempt to capture the Ottoman Sultan in the midst of a very close battle. After Vladislav's death, the Crusader coalition was dispersed and the victory belonged to the Turks. The reason I ranked the Crusade of Varna as the worst crusade is due to the aftermath of the crusade. Vladislav's death ended the Polish-Hungarian-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was the only power in Eastern Europe that could match the Ottomans. After Vladislav, the Hungarian crown eventually passed on to Hungarian nobility, severing the alliance and ties between Hungary and Poland. The chaos in Eastern Europe following Varna allowed the Ottomans the breathing room to besiege Constantinople in 1453 and firmly establish themselves in Europe. Varna was the last chance the Christians had in kicking the Ottomans out of Europe, and they not only wasted it, but also made their situation much worse. All this comfortably puts the Crusade of Varna at the bottom of the list as the worst crusade ever. At number 13, we have the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade was launched in 1145 as a response to the fall of the county of Edessa to the forces of the emerging Muslim warlord Imad ad-Din Zengi. To top the grandeur of the First Crusade, this one was led by actual kings, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. However, the adventurers and warlords that led the First Crusade proved to be much better commanders than the High Kings. The Crusader force coming from Europe was roughly 30 to 40,000 strong combined. However, there was a clear lack of cooperation. The French and German armies entered Anatolia in piecemeals and got ambushed one by the Turks. Almost the entire German army was annihilated within weeks of entering Anatolia. The French army was more resilient. They managed to fend off some ambushes, however, by the time they reached Antioch, due to constant Turkish harassment, sickness, and exhaustion, almost the entire army was destroyed. At the end, no more than a few thousand reached the Holy Lands. However, it wasn't over yet. The new arrivals merged with the local Outremer armies in 1148 and realized that Edessa was a fool's errand by now, so instead they targeted the much closer Damascus. The siege lasted for 4 days before the forces of Nur ad-Din Zengi arrived and drove the Crusaders away. Thousands died on the retreat. What was so bad about the Second Crusade was that it really united the Muslim world. The First Crusade seemed like a raid to the Muslims, and they had failed to understand what was really at stake. But when Damascus was targeted, everything changed. Damascus was arguably the second or the third most important city in the Islamic world. It was the capital of the Caliphate for centuries, and the attack on Damascus finally alerted the Islamic world, leading to a general spirit of jihad. Riding on the waves of increased religious fanaticism, Nureddin Zengi became the hero that saved Damascus. Nureddin then united Iraq and Syria by capitalizing on this new fame, and spent his long reign inflicting serious losses on the Crusaders. The genie was out of the bottle. The Islamic world now stood united. Another major trouble that the Second Crusade caused, aside from manpower losses, was the distrust between the local Crusaders and the Europeans. New arrivals wanted to target Edessa to begin with, and were not happy when the locals that knew the enemy retreated from Damascus before Nureddin could annihilate them. The French and German kings went home feeling betrayed, and no aid would come to the outdreamer until the fall of Jerusalem 50 years later. At number 13 lies the Seventh Crusade. The Seventh Crusade was launched by King Louis IX of France in 1248 against the Ayyubids and the Mamluks, to reclaim the fallen kingdom of Jerusalem by first targeting Egypt. The Crusaders landed in Egypt and took Damietta in 1249. They then made towards Mansoura, where the Egyptians crushed the Crusader army. Stranded, with no way out, the entire crusading force, including Louis, was captured. This crusade was disastrous in several ways. This was the final blow to the manpower and resources of the outdreamer, and the crusading spirit. No crusades of this scale would ever be launched to save the outdreamer. It was game over. On top of that, the glory was claimed by the Mamluk military caste in Egypt. Mamluks, having proven their worth, eventually overthrew the unstable Ayyubid dynasty and formed a formidable military regime. The newly established Mamluk Sultanate would not only cleanse the Middle East of Crusaders, but also put an end to the Mongol invasions a few decades later. The Fifth Crusade was a slightly less disastrous version of the Seventh Crusade. In 1217, the Crusaders marched east in two groups. The main force headed to Egypt, meanwhile the Hungarians headed to the Levant. Just like the participants of the Seventh Crusade, the Crusaders managed to take Damietta, but then they were once again crushed in Mansoura and destroyed. Meanwhile, the Hungarian contingent wasted its time in Levant, getting bogged down in pointless sieges. The Fifth Crusade stands above the Seventh partly because this time the Crusaders weren't completely annihilated, as the Hungarian contingent survived, and partly because of the existence of the Seventh Crusade. The Seventh Crusade put an end to crusading in the Holy Lands. Meanwhile, the fifth one would be followed by the Sixth and Seventh Crusade, so it clearly didn't have the disheartening effect as the Seventh Crusade had. The Crusade of 1101 is one of the lesser known crusades. It was launched directly after the first one, by those that were inspired by the great victories of the first Crusaders. 10 to 20,000 Crusaders marched on Turkish Anatolia, following the tracks of the first Crusade. However, they lacked the muscle this time. The Crusaders were surrounded and then destroyed by the Turks. The significance of this crusade was that it proved to the Muslims that the Crusaders weren't invincible, and it also robbed the outdreamer from considerable manpower. However, aside from these two, the Crusade of 1101 didn't cause any long-lasting disasters. That's why it sits at number 10. The Crusade of Nicopolis was launched by mainly French nobles from Burgundy against the rising Ottomans in 1396. Once in Eastern Europe, they were also joined by local Christians of Hungary and Wallachia. After massacring the local Christians on their way, the Crusaders were crushed by the Ottoman forces. The French contingent was destroyed, however the Hungarian and Wallachian armies left the battlefield, largely unharmed, which was a major saving grace for this crusade. At the end, the Christian position was not made any better or worse after the Battle of Nicopolis. Lord Edward's crusade was the last of the main crusades, and it is sometimes called the Ninth Crusade. Led by the future English king, Edward Longshanks, the Crusaders arrived in the Holy Land and formed an alliance with the Mongols against the Mamluks. After failed attempts to unite and restore Outremer, the Crusaders packed up and left. Although it didn't achieve its goals, the Ninth Crusade protected the remaining Crusader outposts for a few more years and caused no harm. Overall, the Ninth Crusade was neutral in its effects, and the rest of the list will be about successful crusades. The Eighth Crusade was launched by the hero of Seventh Crusade, Louis IX. As soon as he was released from captivity in Egypt, he launched another crusade, this time in North Africa. His army landed in Tunisian shores and besieged the city of Tunis. The crusade came to an end when Louis died of illness during the siege, which disheartened the Crusaders. At the end, Crusaders signed a favorable trade deal with the Tunisians and left. Although this crusade failed to achieve its ultimate goal, at least the Crusaders were able to obtain favorable trade rights. At number 6, we have three minor crusades tied. The Alexandrian Crusade of 1365 saw the Crusaders capture and sack the grand city of Alexandria. The Venetian Crusade of 1122 resulted in the capture of Tyre, and in 1110 the Norwegian Crusade ended with the capture of Sidon. All these crusades were relatively minor but ended with respectable gains. The Crusade of Emperor Henry started in 1197, right after the Third Crusade. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI headed to the Outremer and captured the strategic port of Beirut from the Ayyubids. Although relatively modest, this crusade greatly helped Outremer in its survival into the late 1200s. The Third Crusade is probably the most famous one in this list. It was launched after the capture of Jerusalem by Saladin in 1187 and was led by the famous crusader King Richard the Lionheart of England. From 1189 to 1192, Saladin and Richard battled each other bitterly, and the Crusaders won almost every single battle. Meanwhile up north, the German Crusaders, headed by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, invaded Anatolia and even captured the Turkish capital of Iconium. Though despite his early successes, Barbarossa would drown while crossing a river. Meanwhile, the main crusading force, despite its victories, failed to deal a crushing blow to Saladin. At the end, Richard had to leave for England, leaving the Outremer once again to its fate. However, it wasn't all for nothing. Overall, the Third Crusade was a massive success. Although the Crusaders failed to capture Jerusalem, they had saved the Outremer from the brink of total destruction. Richard managed to secure the forts and cities of the Levantine coast, which would continue to resist the Muslims for another century. On top of that, Cyprus was also taken from the Byzantines and would serve as a forward base for Catholicism until the Ottoman conquest in late 16th century. Salahuddin's armies and prestige also had taken a serious beating, thus allowing the outtremer to take a deep breath. Overall, the Third Crusade was extremely successful and sits at number 4. The Sixth Crusade is one of the lesser known crusades, despite its massive success. In 1227, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire took the cross and sailed to the Holy Lands. He then capitalized on the internal divisions of the Ayyubid state and secured Jerusalem during the consequent negotiations, without shedding any blood. Jerusalem would remain under Christian control for roughly 15 years, before being inevitably captured again by the Muslims in 1244. Now, I know this will be an extremely unpopular one, but hear me out. The Fourth Crusade started in 1202 with the goal of taking back Jerusalem, but ended with the Crusaders capturing Constantinople from the Byzantines and the establishment of the Latin Empire. This crusade is usually unfairly criticized for attacking fellow Christians. However, I don't think this is a fair argument. First of all, the Byzantines were not a part of the Catholic world. They were Orthodox, and the Crusaders didn't owe anything to the Byzantines. In fact, since the First Crusade, the Byzantines have been actively sabotaging the crusading efforts as they saw the Latins as a threat. The developments that led to the sack also allow for extra room for moral ambiguities. However, that's not what this ranking is about. At the end of the day, the Fourth Crusade was a massive success. With a single blow, the Christian schism was effectively ended on a political level. The capital of the Orthodoxy was captured by the Crusaders, and in its stead, the Latin Empire rose. The participants grew rich in spoils and gained large swathes of lands. At the end, Rome had triumphed over Constantinople. And at number 1, we have the original Crusade. The First Crusade was undoubtedly the most successful of all the Crusades. On an unseen scale, the Crusaders headed to the Holy Lands and crushed every single Muslim army that stood in their way. They then proceeded to overrun vast swathes of lands in Levant, meanwhile aiding the Byzantines to reclaim a huge chunk of Anatolia. It doesn't get any more successful than that, for sure. Thank you for watching. That's the end of my list. Please leave a like if you liked it, and I will see you in the next one.